Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about embedded sentences, relative clauses in English and Korean. So embedded sentences and relative clauses in English. An embedded sentence is also referred to as a relative clause. It is a subordinate clause that is placed in the middle or sometimes at the end of a sentence. A subordinate clause is a sentence-like structure that contains a subject and a verb and is usually introduced by a conjunction. The subordinate clause is also dependent upon the main clause. And because of this, a subordinate clause can never stand alone as its own on a sentence. A sentence can be embedded into another sentence as a noun, an adnominal, or an adverb. And a relative clause adds additional details to the middle of a clause, but they do not contain pronouns. And that is one of the main reasons they cannot be their own sentence. Okay, relative clauses. The relative clause is different from other subsystems as it is dominated by what is called a noun phrase. A noun phrase is a word or a group of words that functions as a noun. They typically act like a subject, an object, or a prepositional object within a sentence, but more simply put, they're just nouns that come with modifiers attached to them. An example of these would be the spotted puppy is up for adoption. This is an example of a noun phrase that is acting as a subject. So the subject is the spotted puppy, and the relative clause is that it is up for adoption. At the zoo, I saw a striped zebra. This is an example of a noun phrase as an object to a verb. In this case, the verb saw. So it's like, what did you see? A spotted zebra. And Mary lives in an electric household. This is an example of a noun phrase as a prepositional object. In this case, the preposition is the word in. So it's like, what does Mary live in? An electric household. Which noun is being modified? Relative clauses modify what is known as the head noun. This helps to restrict the set of potential reference or to provide an additional description about the chosen reference. A referent is a person or a thing to which a name or like a linguistic expression or other symbol refers to. So in this sentence, Mary saw me, Mary is a referent because it's referring to the person that actually is Mary. And me is a referent also as it is referring to the person that's speaking the sentence, which would be me. So what is a head noun? According to the Oxford Dictionary, a head noun is the noun which other words in a noun phrase qualify, or a noun which is a head. So an example of that in the sentence, the duck that the rabbit knocked down chased the squirrel. The duck is the head noun because it's the one that's being modified, as we can tell by the relative pronoun that. And so even though there's multiple nouns within the sentence, we know which noun is being modified. So even if you scramble them up and change it to the rabbit that knocked down the duck, chased the squirrel, you know which noun is being modified by that relative pronoun, that in this case. So relative clauses start with an element called a relative pronoun, as I mentioned before. And those can be words like who, whose, which, where, when, and that. And they are most often used to define or identify the noun that precedes them. So why relative clauses are used. So say you have two sentences, as in here, Max was making a clay sculpture. He loved art lessons. And you want to combine them. Well, the second sentence adds more information to the first sentence. So this second sentence can be turned into a relative clause by adding the relative pronoun who. So then you get the sentence, Max, who loved art lessons, was making a clay sculpture. So more examples of relative clauses would be like a notebook is a computer which can be carried around. So here the noun is a computer with a relative clause to this noun being which can be carried around. Yesterday was a day when everything went wrong, with the day being the noun and when everything went wrong being the relative clause. And can I have the pencil that I gave you this morning? As you can see, as I stated before, relative clauses cannot be sentences by their own because you can't just say which can be carried around or when everything went wrong or that I gave you this morning. So that's why it says that they are dependent upon the main clause, which the main clause in the first sentence would be a notebook is a computer, which can by itself be a sentence. So now I'm going to talk about the differences between Korean and English relative clauses. Korean utilizes relative clauses much more frequently than they are used in English. Unlike with English, where the noun that is being modified comes before the relative clause, in Korean, the relative clause comes before the noun that is being modified, and that is because in Korean, they use head final relative clauses. Korean does not have relative pronouns, but instead uses a mandatory suffix, also known as an adnominal. And both the relative pronouns and the Korean marker are called complementizers, meaning that they connect the relative clauses to the noun phrase. And Korean complementizers are mandatory when being used with relative clauses, but in English, complementizers can be optional, as is the case with the relative pronoun that, which is very often left out. So relative clauses in Korean. In our language classes, we learn them as the noun modifying form. And the suffix that you're going to use when you're making a relative clause in Korean depends on the type of verb. So if you're using an action or a descriptive or an adjective, the tense of the verb, past, present, or future. And to modify a noun and create a relative clause, you add the adnominal ending 는 for present tense verbs and adjectives, 은 for past tense verbs, at, ot, yotan for past tense adjectives, 을 for future tense verbs and adjectives, or just in for nouns. And you add these at the end of a verb, an adjective, or a noun preceding the noun you want to modify. So examples of this would be like 수미가 읽는 책, which is the book that Sumi reads. 교실에 있는 학생, the students who are in the classroom, or 박 선생님이 일하시는 대학교, the university where Mr. Park works. An adnominal is a sentence that is embedded in another sentence and is used as an element of modifying a following noun phrase. And as a grammatical process, adnominalization can in general be divided into relativization and complementation. Korean relativization is a controversial subject for linguists. They really can't agree on like how it's specifically utilized and how it should be defined within the Korean language. And so there are a whole lot of thought processes on that. So I couldn't really find anything to just like give a basic definition as to what it is. Complementation is when the noun explains and summarizes the content of the entire clause as a whole. And complementation can be separated into direct and indirect. So examples of these are relativization in the sentence 내가 좋아하는 꽃은 장미다. The flower that I like is the rose. Here the head noun 꽃 is an element that has been pushed out from the relative clause. And in terms of both structure and semantics can be interpreted as the direct subject of the verb 좋아하다. So that means that we know that we're talking about the type of flower that, I like. In complementation, the sentence 내가 장미를 좋아하는 사실을 친구들은 다 안다. All my friends know the fact that I like roses. Here the head noun 사실 is not an element from the relative clause and instead summarizes the entire clause as a whole. So what that sentence with this relative clause in it is saying that my friends know that it's a fact that I like roses. And so it's talking about the entire um, clause together and not just, as in relativization, the flower only. So direct and indirect complementation. Direct complementation occurs when the adnominal ending replaces the final ending of the verb in a relative clause. So here in our, using our same example from the last slide, you can see here with the verb joahada, that nominal ending nun is just added to it, and that makes it directly complementary to the noun sashu. Indirect complementation occurs when the final ending on the verbs are not deleted and the abnominal endings are simply added on after them. So in this example, 나는 민수가 장미를 좋아한다는 사실을 몰랐다 is, you see the verb 좋아한다, the verb ending is not cut off. And that nun, that abdominal ending, is just added on after the handa. And we know that handa is a form of indirect quotation, right? And so that's why they're called indirect, because they incorporate indirect quotes, meaning the end of this relative clause shows that the speaker is talking about information that they either heard from someone else or they learned about indirectly. And some nouns can be served as a head in both direct and indirect complementation, while others can only be used with one of the other two types of complementation. And so that is the end of my presentation, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.